Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I am going to start. My name is Emily Singer Lucio. I'm the ADA coordinator for the University of Maryland in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Welcome. We have enabled captions, so for anyone who may need captions, they should be enabled. If there's any issue, please put it in the chat. I want to welcome Demetria Joyner from our office, who will be assisting me with any technical issues and responding to questions. She's also going to put a link in the chat to the slides, so you'll have that as well. So today we're talking about making events and meetings accessible to all. So things to look at when you're planning an accessible event is publicity and registration, event location, audio and visual settings, seating, dietary restrictions, and when we're also going to talk a little bit about web-based meetings. So a lot of what we're talking about is in-person meetings, but we're also going to be talking about web-based meetings, since I know we're doing a lot of both these days. So first of all, the most important thing you can do when you publicize an event is always make sure to include an accessibility notice. I like to include them in any materials that are going out about the event, whether it be an email or a poster or a flyer or a cling or any other type of advertisement you have. I always suggest putting some type of notice that says the name and the contact information that says if you need disability accommodations, here's who to contact. And I often get the question is so who should I put as the point of contact on these? And I suggest you put somebody who knows about the event, knows all the details, and make sure you put an email and a phone number. The reason I suggest this is so that so that if somebody emails you or contacts you and says, I need accommodations, you can helpfully address their questions and say, tell them a little bit about the program. So for example, if someone calls you or emails you and says, I need any materials in alternative formats, you can say, great, here's the materials that we're planning on either handing out or distributing. They're on our website, but if you need them in alternative format, let me know how best I can help you. And so they might be able to say to you, I need them in a large print, or if you can email them to me electronically in a Word document, then I can put them on my screen reading device and have access to them myself. And then all you need to do is send them a Word document of the file, and then you're done. And that's great. If they need something more complicated, like an interpreter, again, then you can talk through with them about the event and say, okay, well, we have a main session, we have breakout sessions, here's how our program works. Tell me when you're going to need an interpreter. Are you need it for the whole thing? Or are you just going to need it for the sessions? Which sessions are you doing? And then you can work with our interpreter services on campus to arrange that. The other thing you can also do is if you have a registration form for your event, you can add a question on your registration form that asks them to explain in more detail what type of accommodations they need. But at a minimum, I still recommend you put an accessibility statement. It's in your publications because it's welcoming. It shows the community that you're willing to work with them, that you're inviting to people with disabilities, things like that. One other thing I'm going to suggest, and that is if you have a really large event where you're expecting more than 500 or so people, I really like to encourage people to try and automatically include an interpreter, because, I guess the best way to say this is that when we were all students in university, right? We had the option to say, hey, I'm going to go to this event tonight, or hey, I would love to go to this event tomorrow night. And you could just decide at that moment if you wanted to go or not. Unfortunately, people who require interpreters don't have that same flexibility. But likelihood is if we have a really large event that includes a lot of people, then there's a better chance that somebody with a disability might be in attendance. And so if we can by default budget and plan to include an interpreter for a really large event, that's a wonderful thing to be doing, and it's inclusive, and it makes people feel like, oh, I don't have to do something separate. I don't have to arrange a separate accommodation. I can just go and attend like anybody else would. So one of the things I suggest when you're planning an event is to sit down and look at your budget and make sure you're budgeting for interpreters and any other costs you may have related to this. And I'm always happy to meet with departments as they're planning an event to talk through their budget and accommodations. One thing I do want to note is if you don't put your events in the campus calendar, then they're not obviously easy to view by everybody. And so obviously what we want to do is promote them as much as possible, particularly if they are accessible. So make sure you add your event to the campus calendar. And when you submit an event at the bottom of the page, there are a couple different event categories you can do. One is diversity and inclusion, and the other is disability and accessibility. So if you tag those events, then they actually get loaded on our diversity and inclusion calendar and posted on our website. So they get more publicity and viewing by people. Another thing I just want to highlight is that we have a new page, a new website called Accessible Media Content, and I'm going to switch my screen real quick just to share this with you. Let me just see if I can do this real quick. Yep. Okay. Hopefully you can see this website. Demetria, can you see the accessible media content? Okay, great. So this is our new accessible media content page on our Maryland brand site, and it is linked in the slides, so you should be able to access it. It talks about making media and things accessible. It's a great resource for creating accessibility on your brand, on your websites. And print accessibility as well. So I highly encourage you to look at that when you can. Again, the link is on the slides that you should have in the chat. Okay, let me go back to viewing the slides. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about event location. When you're planning an event, I strongly encourage you to make sure that your event is in an accessible location for all of your guests. Let me also just add that if you're bringing in a speaker or some other individual to present on campus, please always ask them if they need accommodation. Sometimes we neglect to ask that question, and I've been in situations where a student group has planned an event and they have not asked about the speaker themselves, and we had to switch the rooms. This didn't happen at Maryland, but we had to scramble to find a different location for the event where the speaker could actually access the stage, and it made it a little bit difficult. So make sure that you're looking at all of those things when you plan your event. And if for any reason a non-accessible meeting room is chosen, and then the sponsor receives a request for an individual with this disability, then you must make every effort to work with the room scheduling department to find an alternative room that's accessible. Something else to look at, especially again, if you're planning a large event, is there disability parking along the path of travel to the facility? And is the main path of travel and the entrance accessible? So you may want to make sure that that's accessible. Also, if you're going to put out like sidewalk signs directing people to your event, please I encourage you to make sure to direct everyone to the accessible event, because if you set those out and it direct people to a non-accessible entrance and then somebody with a disability is following those signs, then they don't know where to go. So I just always encourage people to direct people to the accessible entrance. Okay, audio and visual. You want to ensure effective communication. First of all, we've talked about ASL interpreters, so you want to make sure that you've done that. One of the things that you want to make sure with interpreters is that we're fortunate to live in an area of the country that we have a large number of interpreters available. But one of the issues we have is because we also have such a large deaf community that sometimes we can't get an interpreter at the last minute. So one of the things I always encourage people to do, again, when planning the event, is to go ahead and reserve an interpreter for your event in the planning stages. But pay particular attention to the cancellation deadline. Oftentimes they let you cancel at no charge within, say, 72 hours of the event. So keep that in mind. And then if you do not get any requests for an interpreter 72 hours before the event, then you can go ahead and cancel the interpreters and not be charged. However, if after that 72-hour period happens and after you've canceled the interpreter, you do get a request for an interpreter, What you need to do at that point in time is alert the person that you will need to make a good faith effort to try and get an interpreter back. And again, this goes back to the statement that I mentioned earlier. It's a good idea to put in there that a time frame, to say we encourage people to make accommodations within a certain time frame, and if after that time frame they do not make the request, then or if they miss that deadline, then you will make a good faith effort to make the accommodations, but it cannot be guaranteed. But again, we have to make a good faith effort. And so I'd reach back out to the interpreting group that you were working with to see if you can get an interpreter back. But if you can't, then you're going to have to make alternative arrangements and work with that individual directly to see what can be done. Same thing for transcribers in CART. Luckily, we have some really good resources for, obviously, if you're doing a Zoom meeting, you can have a captioning included that helps. And if you're familiar with AI, you can often include AI resources when you're doing transcribing of your meeting, captioning of your meetings live. But again, you can work with our communication services through ADS to arrange for live transcribers in CART if you need them. One other thing I want to note is that if you plan to post your video recording of your sessions on a website, please make sure you include post-production captioning. And you can go to the IT website, which I'll show you in a little bit, where we use Panopto. We have a service we use for Panopto. I think it's $1 per minute to create captioning for your videos, and then create captioning for your videos before you post them online. Please don't post them online without post-production captioning, because then they're not accessible. I talked a little bit earlier about alternative formats. Most of the time, you may be asked to do large print, electronic. Braille is very rarely asked for these days, but if you get a request for that, again, you can contact our communication services office in ADS about that if you needed that in alternative format. Large print, that's easy enough for you to do if you're printing a program for the event. I oftentimes encourage people just to print 5 or 10 extra copies in large print, but don't just leave them out, because then people don't know that they're available. So make sure you advertise and say, if you need a large print program, we have them available. Please reach out to an usher or an organizer. That's the only way people know they're available. Or put in your program, this program is available in large print. Reach out to one of the ushers or the organizers or whatever. Because really, again, that goes back to being inclusive of everybody and the concept of universally being accessible to everybody. I talked a little bit about video. If you've got videos that you're showing at your event, please make sure they're captioned in advance. And then if you've got a PowerPoint, I know it's sometimes tedious and people don't like it, but it's helpful to people who may not be able to read it for whatever reason. It's best if you can read as much of it as possible for everybody to be inclusive. We do have assistive listening devices on this campus. If you're doing a program that's for students, they can get an assistive listening device through the ADS office. Most UMD lecture halls have assistive listening technology built into the AV systems, so the receiver can be checked out from the classroom support office. Sekou Stadium and Xfinity also have assistive listening devices built in, and handsets are located at the Fan Assistance Center upon request. And then the Clarice also has assistive listening devices built in, and handsets are available at the ticket office. So that's another resource available to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So if you have a lot of seating, you may want to reserve some seating up front for those who may need to be able to see the sign language interpreter. When you're spacing out your seating, you may want to cordon off sections for people who use wheelchairs. If you go to a lecture hall that has fixed seating, make sure that there's a seating area for individuals who use a wheelchair. And then the other thing is, again, if you've got a seating area that's got stairs, make sure you reserve seating for those with limited mobility who may not be able to walk up and down stairs easily or sidestep into the middle of the row. Again, these are all things you can talk through when you're doing your planning meeting, and I'm happy to come to the planning meeting to talk through these things as you're figuring out your event. If you're doing food at your event, I know oftentimes we are very accustomed to planning vegetarian and vegan options. Sometimes you may get people who have gluten allergies, so make sure to include gluten options. Again, if you've got a form, a registration form, this is something else you can put in the registration form that says if you have specific dietary restrictions, please let us know in advance. This is again something you can also include in your statement in the publicity materials that I mentioned at the beginning. So if you're doing web-based meetings, make sure you explain communication things for effective meetings, like to use the raise hand feature to put questions in the chat, how people can unmute themselves. Make sure you provide your slides and materials in alternative formats if they need them. You can do, obviously with Zoom, you always want to include the live transcript. So please make sure you enable that in your meetings. Provide a captioning recording with the slides of the event. Whenever we post a meeting after an event, we do post-production captioning of the recording, again, through Panopto. And then there's also the UMD accessibility guide for Zoom presentations, which you can also access. I want to switch for 1 second here, again, to show you. This is our accessibility website on campus. If you're not familiar with this has a lot of information about accessibility in general on campus. It's accessibility.umd.edu. Several times I've mentioned about IT accessibility. This is a page about event accessibility on this website that has some of the things I've mentioned, including some of the statement that we recommend when publicizing events, interpreters and transcribers, and a link directly to communication and access services, audio and visual accessibility and disability services, their resources, and then captioning, and then making things accessible. Here's our IT accessibility website, and the captioning is on here. Let me just find it here. Where is it? Sorry, here's Panopto accessibility. This is where you can do captioning for your event after the fact. So all of those resources are on there. There's also information about seating. There's also a guide to planning accessible meetings and sample organization for seating. All of that is on here. And again, a link to requesting ASL transcribing or captioning through our website, through the communications and access services. Okay, let me go back to the slideshow. One other thing I want to mention that sometimes people don't always think about is color blindness. So when you're creating a website or presentations, please keep in mind patterns and textures, colors and symbols. I mentioned earlier about our media website that talks about accessible media. A lot of this is on there. Underline links to differentiate between regular text and anchor text. Avoid using poor color combinations such as green, red, blue, purple. And then there is a link here about color blindness and designing things for color blindness. Again, I'm going to switch back real quick to the accessible media content page I mentioned earlier about Michigan Maryland brand. They have information about this. Color and contrast is on here. So you can read more about contrasting color, the UMD color contrast guidelines, and your color contrast checker. So all of that is on here. So I encourage you to look at that as you're planning your events. And then finally, there are some resources on the link that was shared about accessible meetings, planning guide, planning accessible meetings, virtual meeting tip sheet, the UMD accessibility guide for Zoom presentations, implementing accommodations and accessibility best practices, and then making events accessible. My contact information is also on here, and so is the website I mentioned. So I know I went through that pretty quickly. I wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions because we always get plenty of questions. So let me stop sharing for a minute so I can focus on that. And Demetra, if you can share with me any questions that were in the chat. And then if you can also reshare the link to the slides for people who joined late, that would be great.
Okay. One question we have in the chat says, is it better to say for accommodations, comma, contact, or to say, please select the accommodations you need? And then Catherine said, I assumed having the contact puts more work on the part of the requester.
So that's a good question. So I would suggest always just putting a simple statement in your publication materials that says, if you have accommodations, to contact the organizer. And the reason I would suggest that is because there's not really a one size fits all for accommodations. Each individual's needs are going to be very different. And depending on your event, you may need to talk through some of the things to determine what's going to work best for that individual. So it's really best if you can have a conversation with them as opposed to sort of doing a cookie cutter approach. But if you create a registration form, you can also just leave an open text box that says, please describe the accommodations you need, and someone will be in touch with you to make arrangements. But make sure that you reach out to them to have a conversation so that they know that you're going to do your part and talk with them about that, and so that they don't think, okay, I've done what I need to do, I'm just going to show up and it's just going to be there. It's best if you can have a conversation. I hope that answers the question. Okay, Demetria, there are other questions?
One moment as they're coming in. Caitlin said, are there certain accommodations that should be automatically incorporated into our events, such as closed captioning, versus ones that are need-based that we only arrange if they are requested?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's what I'm going to share with you is that, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't live in a society right now where everything is accessible to everybody. I would love to be at a place where we didn't even have to make requests for accommodations, right? Where everything was just automatically included and, it was accessible to everybody. I'm going to give you an example of a concept called universal design, right? When we build a building, right, we oftentimes put stairs in front and a ramp on the side. While that's great that we have the ramp, right, it's making a separate route for an individual with a disability to get into the building. If we designed the building initially as a flat level entrance in with an automatic door, not even a push button door, but one that has a sensor at the top, that would allow anybody who uses a wheelchair, anybody who's carrying stuff, anybody who's pushing a stroller, anybody who has physical limitation that prohibits them from being able to physically open a door, all be able to get in along with everybody else. So that would be universally designed for everybody, right? So if we do that, then it's accessible to everybody. Same thing with sort of this type of thing. As you're planning your event, if we can be inclusive with everybody from the very beginning, that's extremely helpful, right? So if you have the budget and can be inclusive and include interpreters, that would be great. I understand that's a budget issue, but if you can do it from the very beginning to be inclusive for everybody and advertise that that's available in your promotion, because I don't want you to spend the money on that and then not have anybody show up that needs it, right? That would be helpful. But if you're doing any type of video or Zoom presentation, please always include captioning. Please always include any type of text included in that, because that's really going to be beneficial to everyone and universally accessible. And so hopefully that makes sense. I know that was a long answer to your question, but I wanted to make sure to talk about universal design in there.
Another question we have says there are some events that we'd had folks request accommodations last minute and then they get upset that they cannot accommodate that because of short notice and the events have not been mandatory. And given the short notice, they weren't able to accommodate. How are mandatory versus non-mandatory event accommodations viewed for the university? And are there rules and laws around mandatory versus non-mandatory?
So great question. So we are legally obligated to make everything we do accessible. So anytime we plan an event, it has to be planned to be accessible. This is the whole point of putting in a statement in advance, and we can put a time frame in there. And we have to abide by that timeline and say, we are going to make the event accessible. And if you need to request accommodations, please do it within this certain period of time. If they don't make the request within the time frame that you set out, and the time frame really should be within it, like no more than a week. Like, so say you're planning an event, say all accommodations have to be requested within a week of the event. If after that they make a request for accommodations, then we have to, by law, make a good faith effort to try and accommodate. If there's a logistical reason why we cannot accommodate, then we have to be able to justify why that was really physically not possible to do. If you're up against that situation, I would encourage you to reach out to me, and let's have a conversation about that, because we could be an issue. It could be an issue for legal compliance if we're not able to make an event accessible. But this is why we really need to be thinking about this as we're planning an event, because we are legally required to make everything we do accessible. I hope that answers the question.
I think that was the last question.
Okay.
In the chat.
Okay, thank you, Demetria. Are there other questions that people want to just ask using the raise hand feature? Julia.
Hi, good afternoon. A challenge that sometimes my unit faces, we have ongoing programs, and sometimes they're over Zoom, and they're open, and we don't always know who's coming and what needs they may have. And trying to, for example, if we needed to provide closed captioning over Zoom, my understanding is that a request for that would require like an actual live person joining the Zoom to do that. And so I think this is a little bit related to a previous question, but there's a challenge in kind of in making those accommodations. We haven't come across that situation yet, but also we want to be able to be inclusive, and we know it. We should be budgeting for that, but also if we don't know what the demand is, trying to manage this, what do you recommend?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, for the question. So again, most of the time Zoom captioning will be sufficient, but there will be times once in a while where a live captioner or a live interpreter will need to be part of your meeting. And that's not uncommon. What I would suggest is reaching out to ADS, find out what the hourly rate is, and just sort of figure out based on how long you anticipate your event to go, how much you might need to budget for that. I will say that with interpreters, not with transcribers, but with interpreters, for anything that's over an hour, you're likely going to need 2 interpreters. So, I would work with ADS and their communication access services to determine how much the typical rate is, and plan an ADA budget line. If it's something you've not planned for and get a request, so here's the interesting thing about this is that we can't deny this request. I'm just going to share with you that if for some reason somebody were to say, no, sorry, we don't have in our budget, we can't afford to do it, and then the person were to sue the institution, it wouldn't be your department. They would look at their budget or the event budget, but the courts would look at the entire university's budget overall, and they would say there's no way that the university can't afford to do it. The money has to come from somewhere. Now, unfortunately, we don't have an ADA budget line within the institution to cover these across the board. We do ask that the departments cover that, so it would be the responsibility of the sponsoring department to budget for that and to find the money for that to pay for the interpreters or transcribers. Does that answer your question, Julia?
Excuse me, it's very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Emily, there's another question. It says, do all UMD Zoom accounts have access to closed captioning? And
Yes.
can you share a link to instructions for enabling those?
Yes. All Zoom accounts have access to closed captioning, and there's all you have to do is click on the I can't see it from my screen right now, but there is a button that says start captioning. So that's easy to do. Or you could just Google it, but that's very easy to do. I just enable captioning. And when you set up a meeting, you can go in the settings that say enable captioning as well. Other questions? Anybody wants to raise their hand?
There's another question. Says, does that also apply to HIPAA compliant accounts? I know there are some differences between those and other UMD Zoom accounts.
So regardless of whether it's a HIPAA account or not, you should be able to enable captioning. And if there's a request for that, you should enable the captionings. If you're concerned about privacy issues, then I would talk to the individual directly and see what options are best for them. Other questions? Anybody else with a hand raised? Well, we went through that pretty fast, and we usually have a lot more questions. I can't believe I've answered all the questions. Oh, Miriam has a question.
Hi, this is kind of similar to Julia's question. We work on the same team, but I feel like a lot of this guidance is geared towards an event, like a one-time like big event or program where you have like people seated and you have, you know, things that presentations and audience members. But how, like Julia was saying, we have like some ongoing programs or even services, like even one-on-one, you know, services. So how can we prepare for, you know, making those things accessible? Like if we're having appointments people can schedule one-on-one that are on a Zoom, or having, you know, ongoing drop-in Zoom sessions, or different, you know, types of programs that we have that are ongoing and not in that presentation format, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Miriam, thanks for the question. I think a lot of it is the same, right? If it's a one-on-one thing, if when people sign up, again, just always ask them if you need accommodations to please let us know, and you may arrange those accommodations with them. If it's an ongoing thing, again, I would just always have a statement in your announcement that says, if you need accommodations to please let us know, we'll make arrangements for those. If you know who your audience might be, you know, you can always reach out to them directly and see if there's any accommodations you need. If it's an ongoing meeting, for example, like a department meeting or something, and you know who your attendees are, then I wouldn't, you know, worry about it as much, since you know who they are. But if you know that they might need an accommodation, then you can reach out to them directly. For ongoing program where you may not know who the audience is, whether it be a one-on-one session or a group session, again, I would make sure just to always have the statement so that you have the opportunity to have a conversation with them beforehand. But if there's more specific questions you have, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I'm always happy to be part of any planning meetings, so you can share more specifics about your events, and I'm happy to help with you one-on-one.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think there's a question in the chat. Are there locations on campus that are better for attendees with hearing loss, with or without hearing aids, to avoid background noise similar to a restaurant? Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, open spaces can be more of a problematic for people, individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. That's one of the benefits if you can use some place that has an FM system embedded in their microphones and podiums, because then the FM system can block out ambient noise. So that's one thing. It's all the other advantage to having people who are deaf or hard of hearing sit close to the speaker so that they can get the best opportunity to hear them as best as possible. The other thing is that, you know, I think a lot of us, when we watch TV these days, right, sometimes we're watching things that where the actors have an accent or there's some other issue going on. And so some of us by default put captioning on, and it just helps us focus a little bit better. So this is one of the reasons why I like to include captioning whenever we're doing programming. And AI actually makes that a little bit easier these days, so that it's accessible to everyone, right? Sometimes, like I went to an event that was really loud outside, really noisy, but I was able to follow along with the program, even though I couldn't hear the speaker directly because they had a jumbo screen with captioning scrolling at the bottom. So I was able to follow along with the captioning, even though I don't have a disability that requires captioning. So again, it's another thing that focuses on the aspect of universal design so that it's accessible to all of us. So if you can automatically include captions, that's fabulous. Other questions? Oh, Stephanie?
So in addition to kind of the preparation that you already shared for events, is there any additional steps that should be taken if a student already comes with their own interpreter to an event?
Well, hopefully they've notified you in advance if they're coming with interpreter. I'm not clear on why somebody would come with their own interpreter. You know, if a student wants to attend an event, they have to make those arrangements through ADS, but I would assume that ADS would notify the event organizer that a student is bringing an interpreter, because I think that it's very helpful that the interpreter should know a little bit about the program prior to the event. Like for example, when I've worked with commencement events before, right, we oftentimes try and get them a script with the speeches if we can, so that they can practice it. And especially if there's going to be unique terminology and things like that, like if you're doing a scientific lecture or something of that nature, because that's very helpful to the interpreters to be able to practice that. So again, if you're doing an event, it may just be helpful to reach out to ADS and say, you know, we are doing an event. We're happy to work with you if we need an interpreter or whatever, but there should always be some communication. I've never seen an event where an interpreter just shows up with an individual without notifying the event organizer. If that's happening, maybe let me know. But Stephanie, you wanted to further comment?
Yeah, does it matter the scale of the event? Like we're aware and we were contacted for like an orientation. They reached out before, we gave them presentation slides, but for a smaller session, like I just did a registration preparation session for students and an interpreter showed up, but I wasn't able to provide them with like the slides beforehand and I wasn't aware that they would be in attendance.
Yeah, that's a little out of the ordinary. I'm not quite sure why that happened. If you want to chat with me offline, I'd love to know more about that so we can prevent that type of thing from happening in the future. But I don't typically there should be some communication notification. And again, I think a lot of this goes to you all putting a notice in your event stuff and on your registration forms, leaving a box open so that people can notify you if they plan to either if they need an interpreter, and maybe they might say, I'm going to bring my interpreter with me. I don't know, but that way you know how to contact the person who's made the request and to say, hey, we'd like to connect with you to provide you materials for your interpreter or whatever. So the more you can outreach in advance, the better.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I will give you all back a little bit of time in your day. Thank you so much. I'm going to put my email in the chat. If you need to reach me at any point in time, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to work with you as you're planning your events. And that's best if we can do that in advance as opposed to scrambling at the last minute. But thank you all so much for attending today. I hope this was helpful. As again, feel free to reach out to me and have a great day, everyone.